Let's talk now about fabric selection. On page 2, Annette has a list of all the fabrics you're going to need to create Mr. T-Rex. You're only going to need 6, just 6. One for the background, the black, a yellow, a little teeny tiny bit of yellow for his eye, and then a dark gray, a dark skin, and a medium skin. And I found this gorgeous gradient from Northcott's Stonehenge. Linda Ludovico created these beautiful fabrics about 12 years ago now, and they've been so successful, and there's a reason. Isn't that pretty? I just love the way it goes from that dark to the light. And so I am going to fussy cut pieces out of this great fabric to correspond with the codes of my dinosaur. Then I need to decide what colors I need to put where. Since I have 3 remaining colors, the DS for the dark skin, the MS for the medium skin, and the DG for the dark gray, I looked at my chart. This is my cheat sheet made of regular paper. And as I was looking at it, and then also looking at the color picture that Annette provided, I see that in many cases, the DS, the dark skin, and the medium skin are next to each other. I want that to be a high value contrast. So I'm going to create the DS as the darker part of the gradient, the medium skin as the lighter part of the gradient, and then this DG is up sort of at the top of Dear Dinosaur's head. I'm going to make that the medium gradient in here. So you can play with it any way you want. One of the things that you could do is take a picture of this and print it out on paper and then start coloring in and deciding where you want your colors to be placed. The sky's the limit when it comes to color. So what I have done is I've created a little key to remind me what fabrics go with which codes. So the BG is the background, and I wanted this wonderful sort of curry color. I love color contrast. I love complementary colors. When you've got the blue and the gold, those live opposite each other on the color wheels, and I just love the way they play together. Then, of course, we have the BLK, or black. We have the little touch of yellow. I'm going to use a lighter gold color. The MS for medium skin is going to be my lighter side of my ombre. The DG, or the dark gray, is going to be the medium tones of my ombre, and then the DS is going to be the darker tones of my ombre. I made this key. I simply put a piece of double-sided tape down, slapped a little bit of snippets there, and now I can set it aside. Let's go ahead and start ironing our facets onto our fabric. I'm going to start with the background first. Now, when it comes to ironing your pieces onto your fabric, you're going to want to iron them onto the right side of the fabric. The right side of the fabric. And you might say, well, when it comes to these solids, how do I know which is the right side and which is not the right side? Bottom line is, if you can't tell, no one else will either, so don't sweat it. Of course, fabrics like this ombre, this beautiful gradient from Stonehenge, you can definitely tell the right side from the wrong side, so that's not a problem, but don't worry about it with your solids. I'm going to bring all of my little pieces that are labeled BG for background, and I've taken the clip off. I want to start with my larger pieces first, just to make sure I can get enough space available for those. So I'm going to pull out my larger pieces first. Here's a tip for laying your pieces onto your fabric. I like to look for the longest edge. The longest edge is the edge that's going to need the most support when it comes to your fabric and cutting it out. Yes, the freezer paper does provide a good amount of support, but why not allow the fabric to help keep your pieces stable as well? And what I mean by that is when you're working with these long pieces, these larger pieces, sometimes they can be twisted and warped out of shape. And if you put them along the straight of grain, and that is the grain line that runs parallel to the selvage, that is going to absolutely help stabilize that piece. And this is the selvage edge. Look what happens when I pull across the selvage or the straight of grain. It doesn't give very much, does it? Compare that to the cross grain or the bias. The bias really gives. So if you want to protect these long edges, I would always select the longest edge of your piece and put it parallel to the straight of grain. And again, if you're using scraps and you can't tell what the where the selvage is, again, just do that pull test. That'll help you figure out which is the straight of grain, the most stable part of your fabric. So let's go ahead and iron this on. Now, I like to use my big, large iron. I have found that sometimes the small travel irons don't get hot enough. But if you've got a nice, powerful travel iron, go for it, use it. So I'll use it at the highest heat, no steam. And basically, all you have to do, lay it down, run across, and there you have it. You see how that is beautifully adheres to this fabric? And look what happens. I can pull it off and it doesn't leave a residue. Let's go ahead and put it back down. There we go. Do you see how I've also left a good amount of space between this and the edge of the fabric? That's because I'm going to cut this out with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I want to make sure that I have plenty of room over there for that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Same goes for all the other pieces that I'm going to lay down below this. I want to make sure that I leave plenty of space to get a 1/4 inch seam allowance between to each one of those. So here is one that actually, it looks like it's probably the edge of my pattern. There's a nice 90-degree edge. I'm going to find the longest one. I think I want to put that one on the straight of grain. And by default, because this is a 90-degree, this one is going to go on the cross grain, which is the second most stable part of the fabric. But that's okay. I want this, the edge of my block, to be stable. So let's go ahead and drop this in. Put this up over here. Again, this longer side is going to be parallel to the selvage. This will now be parallel to the cross grain, and this will be on the bias. Do you see how I've left a good amount of space between these two pieces? That's because this point, when you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance coming along, you have nice long noses on those little those corners. Of course, I'm always going to suggest that you cut it down to within a 1/4 inch, but as you're going through, you want to make sure you have plenty of room to get those beautiful edges. All right, here's another one. I think I'm going to put this one on the straight of grain, and I think I'm going to arrange it so I can kind of tuck it in a little bit. See, if I put it here, that would work too, but I want to try to use as much fabric wisely as I can. So I'm going to drop it in here, make this parallel with the straight of grain. Let's see, do I have enough space here? I might give myself a little extra space. This looks good, this looks good. And how we doing on the straight of grain? Perfect. There we go. Okay. Here's another one. I think I'm going to use this one on the straight of grain. I'll go ahead and drop this down, leaving plenty of space between. There's no right or wrong way to iron your pieces down. Just be sure that you're leaving plenty of room around them so that you can cut out with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All of my pieces have been ironed on with attention to the longer edges on the straight of grain. And in this case, because I had these two corner pieces, which is the edge of my block, I wanted to put this on the straight of grain and this on the cross grain to give it some good stability. And I paid attention to the fact that I had plenty of space right between my pieces. I'm going to set this aside and start ironing the pieces to my other fabrics as well. Now it's time for me to start ironing my pieces labeled MS for medium skin, DG for dark gray, and DS for dark skin to my lovely gradient, my Northcott Stonehenge gradient. A couple things about using fabrics with lots of dye or lots of colors on them. Sometimes the buildup of colors and or fabrics that have been treated with lots of chemicals in the manufacturing process, sometimes that can interfere with the ability of the freezer paper to adhere to the fabric. So one of the things you might want to do is, if you're using a fabric like this, is to pre-wash your fabric if you have any inkling that you're going to have problems with it. So pre-washing is good for these kinds of fabrics. The other thing I would suggest is not to use a starch product. Sometimes, I know Annette and I might differ on this a little bit, but I have found that sometimes using a product like Flatter or Best Press sometimes also prevents the freezer paper from adhering well to the fabric. You might want to experiment with that, but that has been my experience. If you're having problems with the freezer paper adhering to some of this fabric, you can heat the fabric first. Get it nice and hot. and then put that freezer paper down on it and hit it with the hot iron. So it literally is heating it not only from the top, but from the bottom up. I'm going to go ahead and start ironing my pieces on. Once I've laid down a number of pieces, what I like to do is go ahead and cut this out to make it a little bit more manageable. Here are my pieces labeled DG for dark gray. According to my color key, it is this medium tone of my gradient. So I am ready to start ironing on these pieces onto the medium part of my gradient. Then I'll iron on the pieces labeled DS, which are, according to my color key, part of the darker side of the ombre or the gradient. So then I'll start ironing them on here. Then we'll start cutting them out.